This week, as we're continuing under the umbrella of redefining the purpose of prayer, and we're in week 2, and the title of this week's study is The Definition of Prayer. So if you begin to redefine the purpose of prayer, the purpose of prayer is not to give God new information. The purpose of prayer is not to convince God of something that He needs to be convinced about. The purpose of prayer is not to keep God from making a mistake. The purpose of prayer is going to have to have a whole new definition when you understand that prayer is not the way you get God to do what you think He should do when you think He should do it. Prayer is not the way that you manipulate God. So we're going to have to come up with a completely new definition of prayer. And we are expanding prayer to understand a praying life, a life through which prayer at some level is always flowing. Now, let me illustrate what I mean by that. I want you to think about your brain and what an ingenious invention your brain is. It can multitask like nothing you've ever seen. At any given moment, your brain is performing millions of tasks. It's only because your brain is directing it that your heart knows the rhythm it's supposed to beat. It's only because your brain is giving direction that your eyes know when they need to blink. Your brain is managing every cell in your body. Plus, your brain is remembering your name and your birthday and your social security number. And it's locating you in time and space. It just does everything. Now, I want you to think about the ingenious way your brain can work in this multitasking. Some tasks, some things that you're doing very consciously and deliberately and giving thought to every move. Some things that you're doing are down a level. Like right now, except for the fact that I just mentioned it, right now you're not consciously thinking your social security number, but all I have to do is ask you and boom, there it is. You see, so it's just down a little level. And then there's walking. And it's down several levels, but it's still actively going on. So think of a time when you're driving somewhere familiar and you come to something that makes you have to engage in that action, like you come to a stop sign or something, and you look around and you say, oh, how did I get here? Probably none of you have ever done that. If you see me coming, watch out, because I've done that. But here's how this is working. We've all been there at these moments, and what happened is your brain was perfectly effectively remembering how to drive, remembering where you're going, all the rules of the road, without you giving it conscious, deliberate thought. There it was, and it was perfectly effective. You see what I'm saying? So so I'm going to suggest that at some level in this amazing multitasking brain of yours, the living present Jesus housed in you is praying. And He's depositing His thoughts into your mind. You have the mind of Christ. And He's recreating your desires so that they match His. And He is actively working. Now, some of the time, we are consciously, deliberately, purposefully engaged in that. We are saying prayers. We're listening to God. We're having a conscious interaction with Him. But sometimes our conscious, deliberate mind has to be on another task. And so prayer goes down a level. It doesn't disappear. It's still going on. And when you learn that that's the case, that you are living a praying life, then what you're going to do is you're going to find yourself arranging your days and arranging your thoughts in such a way that more and more often you can deliberately engage with that prayer that's flowing in you. So that begins to change all the contours of your life. Now when you're stuck in traffic, instead of beating on the horn or huffing and puffing, you can, I can engage with what Jesus is doing in my life. And you're going to find that just more and more often it is a deliberate and conscious activity that you're praying and you're hearing from God. But it's going on all the time. And when you have to put it down a level so you can take care of something else, when you come back to it, you're just joining back in with what's been going on. David writes in Psalm 139, "Before a word is even on my lips, lo, O Lord, you know everything about it. You know it all together." What that tells me is that when a need or a desire is so deep in me that it hasn't even come to that level of consciousness where I have words and sentences for it, when it is nothing but an inarticulate groan, heaven has heard it as if I said it perfectly. And when it does come to that level where I can begin to say it in sentences and engage deliberately with the Lord on that matter, I am joining into a flow that has already been going on. God is not depending on what comes out of your mouth. He's depending on what comes out of your heart. And He knows how to read a heart. You know, I sometimes compare it to my oldest son, Brantley, who, I don't know how this happened, but just turned 29. But anyway, when he was little, he was my first child, and he had my full attention day and night. And so Brantley did not find it necessary to learn to speak the English language. He made up his own language, and I kind of knew it. And so Brantley would say, when Brantley would say something to everyone else around, it would just sound like gibberish baby talk. I knew exactly what he was saying. And so he had a word for music that sounded something like this: bak bak. You see where he gets that? And so he had this word for music, and he'd say bak bak. And everybody else would just go, okay, what was that noise? And to me, it sounded as if he had just said, "Dearest mother, would you please put on one of my favorite tunes?" And it had exactly the same effect as if he had said it perfectly. You see, so we worry so much about how to say prayers, what words to say, what order to put them in, how often to say them. And God is saying, I'm not listening. It's not your lips. It's not your lips. It's your heart. And the whole key about prayer is that we have these misconceptions about prayer that drain it of its power. That we can't experience what prayer is able to bring into our lives because we have defined it too little. And we have too many misconceptions. Let's look at some of those misconceptions. One of the misconceptions we have about prayer is what you use to get stuff from God. And now, does God want us to ask for our material needs? He absolutely does. He wants to be the provider of everything. There are two kind of extremes in understanding this. Here's one extreme that says you must never ask for anything for yourself because God has much bigger problems, and that's very selfish to ask for yourself. And so people struggle with that because they don't want to be selfish. Well, here's the problem with that thinking. It thinks God too small, as if God would say, now I would get further on world hunger today, but Jennifer distracted me when she lost her car keys. So you see, when you understand that you're God's favorite, which is just perfectly okay with me because I'm God's favorite. And you have His attention every moment of every day, from the tiniest little thought to the tiniest little pre-thought to the biggest, hugest crises. You are never bothering God. And He wants us to ask for our material needs to be met because He wants us to recognize Him as the giver of everything. So it's not wrong to ask for your material needs. God has said, please do that. But on the other hand, there's the other extreme that treats prayer as if it is the way that we order stuff from the divine warehouse and expect a timely delivery. And when we limit prayer to just asking for stuff from God, and that's the measure of prayer, like, well, I heard I heard this speaker one day, and she asked for red shoes, and she woke up in the morning, there were red shoes right by her bed. It doesn't work that way for me. Doesn't work that way for me either. And when we limit prayer to that, we're missing out on the bigness of its power. Another misconception about prayer is that prayer is the way that we convince God to implement our ideas. And so we make a case, and we try to bring some Bible verses into it, and we put a lot of emotion into it, and try to convince God to implement our ideas. Now let me ask you a question. Do you really want God to do the best thing you can think of? I don't. So prayer is not the way we're going to get God to do what we think He should do. And when you pray that way, prayer is never a release of burden, because you leave a time of prayer saying to yourself, did I make the right case? Did I get through to Him? Could I have said it better? You see, but when we do the Mary and the turning water into wine, the content of prayer just kind of goes like this. She has no wine. And we don't have to convince God. We don't have to make a case. We don't have to argue. Here's another misconception we have about prayer. By prayer, we hold God to His promises. As if He were trying to renege and get out of keeping them. We're not reminding God of His promises. God is reminding us. Now, I know that's how it feels. It feels like we're reminding God. But what's happening is God is awakening in you, stirring in you, bringing to life in you promises that you know. And what He's saying is, this is what I'll do. This is what I've promised you. And so they come out of our mouth as prayers. But the truth is that we're not reminding God. God is reminding us. And so a prayer is not a way to hold God's feet to the fire in case He tries to get out of something. He's eager to fulfill all His promises. Another misconception about prayer is that prayer kind of works like that we're trying to pry riches out of God's reluctant hands, as if God is kind of stingy. And it really takes a lot of argument to convince Him to let go of some of His riches. But the truth is that the Scripture tells us about a lavish God. A God who lavishes love upon us, who is not reluctant to give, who wants to give. And in fact, in a praying life, as you come to understand that it is God who is initiating and you who are responding, so that every single time that you feel compelled to pray, every time it just enters your mind, maybe prayer could play a part in this. Or when you feel pulled toward prayer, however it is that prayer comes into your consciousness, that is because God is calling you. Because the Scripture says, no one seeks for God. No one understands. So every inclination that we have toward God is God pulling us. It feels like it comes from us. He stirs it by bringing something to your attention as He did to Moses. He stirs it by beginning to create a vision and desire in your heart. He stirs it by the love that you have for the people around you that desires the best for them. And it feels like it's coming to us, and then we have to get it to God somehow. But the truth is, it's coming from God. He is imparting His heart to us. He is calling us to prayer. And here's what He says about when He calls us to prayer. I do not tell you to call on me in vain. So when you feel your heart stirred toward prayer in any way, it is God saying, I'm calling you to prayer, and I'm not calling you to waste your time. I'm calling you to prayer because prayer is going to work. I'm calling you to prayer because prayer is going to do what I say it's going to do. It's going to release all of my power and provision into the circumstances of earth. I'm calling you to prayer. It is always a response that we are making to God. So realizing that prayer is responding to God, the living Jesus who indwells you, who is closer to you than the beat of your own heart, who is closer to you than the blood that runs through your veins, who has made you his home. He is stirring prayer in you. He is calling you to prayer. And so one of my favorite authors, E. Stanley Jones, makes this statement. He says, when you have reached out for God, you have reached too far. Or I say it like this. When you say to me, I never feel like my prayers even make it to the ceiling, I'm going to say they don't have to make it that far. He has housed himself in you. He has made himself so accessible to you that he can literally make deposits out of his own heart into yours. He can call you to pray. He can reproduce his prayers in you. We have to keep our senses alert to what the living and present Jesus is doing and speaking in us. As the study goes on, you begin to see already perhaps that the most important thing about prayer is not how to speak to God, but how to hear from God, how to receive from God, how to keep your life in a receptive mode so that at every moment the power of the spiritual realm is moving into the circumstances of earth. And throughout the weeks of this study, we will look carefully at what the Scripture has to say about how to hear from God and how to respond to what God is speaking to us. Remembering these words, before they call, I answer.